What's cracking, big dogs? Welcome back to the HQ, whether you're joining us on the podcast or on YouTube. Happy Monday. You are starting your week off correctly if you are here with me, because it is In the Muck Monday, where we're breaking down two players getting drafted in similar spots for 2018 fantasy football. This week we got another good one, another top tier group of players. We got Julio Jones, we got Michael Thomas, a couple NFC South ball catches. I didn't even suit up in my Julio Jones jersey for the fact that I know I'd have a bunch of y'all in my comments saying that my ass is biased if I were to end up picking Julio Jones. So I stuck away, completely neutral, black. The Falcons wear black, the Saints wear black. We're unbiased here. We bring you big facts only. Y'all should know that by now. I don't really have anything else to say. I'm going to preface this by saying I filmed this video 6 days ago. So if you're watching this on Monday, I filmed it last Tuesday, or last Monday actually. It might be a week ago. So if anything happens with Michael Thomas or Julio Jones within then I don't know what to tell you, bro. I messed up. I'm so sorry from the bottom of my damn heart, but this is the best analysis I can give you up till August 6th. Your man's is going to be in Mexico. I'm leaving for Cancun on Wednesday morning. Thus, I won't have time to film In the Muck Monday, so I got to get ahead of schedule, which is why I'm here. And let's just get cracking, baby. Oh, which y'all really didn't think I was going to whip out the Roddy White jersey, did ya? Woo! All right, before we jump into the video, as always, I want to get your guys' opinion. So before we start the video, drop a comment down below. Would you rather have Julio or would you rather have Michael Thomas? 2018 fantasy football. I have a strong feeling that anyone who owned Julio Jones will automatically revert to Michael Thomas, but I want to hear your opinions and why. So drop that comment down below. I'll give you about 8 seconds. Make sure you hit that thumbs up button while you're down there to let me know you appreciate these videos. I work very, very, very hard on them, so I'll keep them coming as long as you like it. So let me know who you want and drop a comment or a thumbs up down below. All right, let's really get into it right now. We got Julio Jones, 13th pick overall, wide receiver 4. Michael Thomas, 15th pick overall, wide receiver 5. We'll start with my man's Julio Jones. The story of Julio... Excuse me while I rid the place of DNA, because I'm about to murder this goddamn video. Julio, he's amazing, but he can't score touchdowns. He's inconsistent. This is the narrative, right? We all know how good of a player he is. Don't need to argue that. I'm here to dispel the noise and recency bias from the actual truth of the matter. Now, I'm not saying that all that is bullshit. All I'm saying is I'm here to bring out the big facts only. That's what we do here. The first part of that, he's amazing. That is very factual. That is big facts only. There's nothing more to it. Julio is the NFL's all-time leading wide receiver in yards per game, 95.3. He's gone for, listen to this statistic. I feel like there's nothing really more to be said here besides he's gone 4 consecutive seasons with 80 catches, over 1,400 receiving yards. The biggest statistic to take away here, in my humble ass opinion, is yards per route run. This is what PFF calls a predictive statistic. So when they jumble all their statistics together and see which of the stats actually predicts year over year which fantasy wide receivers are going to perform again and again and again, because touchdowns are volatile, catches and yards sometimes can be volatile. Yards per route run was the highest predictive statistic that PFF found to be, which is Scott Barrett, at Scott Barrett DFB of PFF, has been the one that's pushed this narrative, and he's been a huge proponent of this statistic. Here's what we are looking at. The most yards per route run in single seasons over the last, 11, 12 years? Julio Jones owns 3 of them. 3 of the possible 12 years. 2016, 2017, 2015. Those are the three previous seasons, 15, 16, 17. So he's been still elite. There's nothing that has fallen off in terms of a yards per route run perspective. In 2017, last year, he finished number 1 amongst wide receivers in yards per route run for the 3rd straight season and for the 4th time in the last 5 years. Now, look at this chart. This is the 2017 leaders in yards per route run. We see Julio has a pretty hefty lead on 2nd place, Antonio Brown, who has an even heftier lead on 3rd place. So Julio is by far and away the leader on this board, and you can see some pretty damn good names on there. The second column on that chart, snaps in route, right? That second to last column is the concerning part, because you see Julio's numbers, 469, is well below the number of routes that Brown has run, that Keenan Allen has run, that DeAndre Hopkins has run by far, and Michael Thomas. So he's really good at yards per route run, but he doesn't run enough routes, as you could see. So So I wanted to look at his target totals to see what's kind of going on here. Now, over the last 4 years, Julio hasn't seen less than 125 targets in a single season. He's averaged 158 targets over that span, over the last 4 years. But to be fair, to really give you the right perspective, over the last 2 years, it's been down. He was at 145 2 years ago and 125 last year. So was he being less involved in the offense? What was going on? I went to airyards.com to check it out. I wanted to see his target market share outside of that 2015 season, which he saw over 200 targets. So I don't want to say that that was an outlier of a year, because we know Julio absolutely has that kind of potential and that upside, over 200 targets, and could dominate an offense. But looking at the last 3 or 4 years is probably what we can predictively look at for Julio. And in 2015, Roddy White, my man's, was banged up. It was his last season. They had the next leading receiver in that year was Leonard Hankerson. So Julio's target share in that year was 33%, which is way higher than we can expect it to be. Anyways, his target market share has stayed very consistent. In 2014, it was 27%. 2016, it was 27%. And last year, it was actually 28%. So he's still as much involved in this offense, as much of an elite wide receiver one as he's ever been. So on a per route metric, he's seeing the same volume, he's seeing the same high-level production. So can we expect an uptick in those numbers? And I think so. I've talked plenty this offseason about how I expect the Falcons to positively progress into next year, just based on things like touchdown rate and touchdown catch rate for Julio, which we'll dive into in a second. But Matt Ryan saw his lowest pass attempt total since 2009. His 529 pass attempts were his lowest total since 2009. It's their second year under Steve Sarkisian in this offense, so I expect a little bit of a progression, if not a big step forward, because we look at Kyle Shanahan. It took them a year to adopt that offense. Hopefully we see the same thing coming into the second year with Steve Sarkisian. Also, according to PFF, only Tom Brady graded higher at the quarterback position in 2017 than Matt Ryan. Matt Ryan tied with Drew Brees in terms of PFF quarterback rating, or PFF grading, which obviously isn't a perfect scale, but it's telling you that Matt Ryan was still very, very good as a quarterback. All those statistics weren't there, because like I said, his pass attempts were down. The offense hasn't fallen off. Julio is still a big proponent of this offense. They ranked top 2 in the NFL in yards per drive last year, the Falcons, in plays per drive and time of possession per drive, but they just couldn't finish. 15th in points per game. Like I said, Steve Sarkisian, he averaged more points per game in his first season than Kyle Shanahan actually did in his first season with the Falcons. That being said, I expect a statistical bounce back for the Falcons overall as an offense and their scoring offense. Now, the concerns for Julio are definitely trifold, at least from an outside perspective, if you're looking down from a bird's eye view. The first, of course, is the injury concern. I know people are always talking about how Julio's always out or injured or banged up or on the injury report, which is true, but he rarely misses time when you actually look at the games. He's always limping, right? He seems like he's coming off the field all the time, but he has played in 61 of 64 games over the last 4 seasons. So that injury-prone mark has 0 effect on my ranking for him. He's not injury-prone. Consistency is a huge concern for people. So I wanted to break down, is this real, or is consistency a recency bias thing for Julio? So I made this chart, and what I did was look at the last 4 seasons, right? Because those are his high-level seasons productively with the Falcons, and I think that's like a real benchmark to base off, what we can expect from Julio. And what I did was, the first column is the year, the second column is the number of games played that year, the third column is, now this is subjective, I guess, because it depends what you consider consistent. And I marked consistent as having a game with 85 plus receiving yards and or a receiving touchdown. So maybe that's not considered consistent to you, but I feel like that's pretty statistically significant to be, consistent. So that's what the number of games, the third column is the number of games with 85 plus yards and or a receiving touchdown. And the fourth column is the percentage of his overall games that had 85 plus yards or receiving touch and or a receiving touchdown. Julio's 2017 was much lower than the other seasons, and I would kind of consider it an outlier year, because if you look at the other 3 seasons, or the 4 seasons combined, the average is 66%. 66% of his games he had 85 plus yards or a touchdown. Last year it would dip down to 50%. So the big thing to take away here is when you look at recency bias, you have to be able to differentiate recency bias with a player's decline. Those are two different things. Recency bias just means a down year. Decline, right? His numbers could absolutely be down because maybe he's declining in terms of skill and separation, but that's not the case. His game speed is still elite. His target separation is still elite. It was just a statistical down year and an outlier year for a guy like Julio Jones. 1,400 yards in 4 straight seasons. I was just listening to a podcast with J.J. Zachariason, the late round quarterback, and he was talking about, he basically put together every single wide receiver that has scored or that has racked up 1,400 receiving yards, and on average that receiver catches, I think it was like 8.3 touchdowns or something like that. So his 3 touchdowns last year is a huge outlier, and he's had like 6, 8, 6 in the previous year, so you would expect it to be around 6, 7, or 8 touchdowns. Last year, obviously, was just not good for Julio. And he said the same thing with Calvin Johnson, right? Julio's percentage in terms of his yardage, while it should have been, for someone who had 1,400 receiving yards, it should have been around 8 touchdowns. The year that Calvin Johnson had 1,900 receiving yards, he only caught 5 touchdowns. But the next year, he caught, I think it was something much higher. It was either like 8 or 10 or 12 or something like that. So he bounced back in a big way. And it was just, touchdowns are volatile, guys. And I think you're seeing a lot of recency bias because Julio's have dipped so low. But I always talk about how you should not be focused on guys whose touchdowns are volatile. Like, you depend on touchdowns. Julio is the opposite of that. He's giving you 80 yards, 80 catches, 85 catches, 1,400 yards every single season. And if he does come back to the norm with touchdowns, or even increase or go over his expected touchdown rate, you're going to have an absolute monster season out of Julio. So in terms of consistency, I think last year was an outlier, because in the previous years he was at 64%, 80%, 67% in terms of his games that he was actually consistent in. And the last concern is obviously, as I'm talking about, touchdowns. He had a new rock bottom in 2017. He caught only 3 touchdowns. And this came after a year that everyone complained because Julio was such a beast. Everyone's like, you got to feed him in the red zone. You got to feed him in the end zone. And you know what? That happened. He had 19 red zone targets and 11 10 zone targets, which was the 8th highest for red zone targets and the 3rd highest for 10 zone targets among NFL wide receivers last year. According to Player Profiler, Julio saw over 44% of his team's end zone targets. 5th highest percentage among NFL wide receivers. So he got his looks, man. He just did not eat. So I'm like, is Julio bad in the end zone? What happened? What's his touchdown rate? What does he normally do with this rate of volume? So again, I made the chart. The games played in the second column, the number of touchdowns, and the touchdown rate. So basically, the percentage of games in which he scored a touchdown. The last 3 years, 40%, 50%, 43%. Very consistent. Last year dropped all the way down to 19%. Over the last 4 years, his average has been about 38%, and that was heavily weighed down by last year's 19%. So you can see, again, the touchdown rate was an outlier year last year after 3 consistent years of 43% or around that. Also, his career touchdown per game, right? His touchdowns per game rate since 2011 is over 50%. Which is a crazy number if you exclude last year. So every year up until last year, from 2011 through 2016, he was averaging a touchdown in over 50% of his games. Last year, it randomly dipped down to 19%. That is not a thing you expect from Julio to happen again. Lastly, and the most predictive statistic in my opinion, is TD catch rate. So the same thing, the same way we look at quarterbacks and we're able to predict whether they're going to have positive or negative regression in the touchdown column, right? Same way that Matt Ryan had a ridiculously high, like 7.4% of his passes go for touchdowns in his MVP year, we could easily see that coming back down to his career average, right? So you look at the number of pass attempts and the percentage of those that went for touchdowns, and it usually comes back around to the norm. Same thing, we could do that with touchdowns and the catch rate, and this is what I have for you in Julio Jones's chart right here. You can see, again, receptions in the second column, the number of touchdowns in the third column, and then the touchdown catch rate. Now, obviously, it seems a lot smaller there on the right side, but you can see the percentages, again, guys, very, very low for 2017. It was always around near 6%, if not higher. So a huge dip last year, and it's an outlier of a year again. And it might not seem like a lot, right? 2% or 2.5% or 3% might not seem like a lot, guys. When you're getting 140 or 150 targets, 3% of that is the difference between catching 3 touchdowns and 6 touchdowns or 8 touchdowns, 9 touchdowns, and being wide receiver 6 or wide receiver 4 and being wide receiver 2 or wide receiver 1. So those small percentage points count when you're getting a ton of targets. So that is absolutely a huge number. And prior to 2017, Julio's career touchdown catch rate was over 8%. I can't emphasize how much you are looking at recency bias when you're looking at Julio Jones and how down of a year last year was in terms of consistency and touchdowns. Now, most of it was touchdowns, right? Just because the touchdown rate was so small that obviously if you're not scoring a lot of touchdowns, your fantasy points overall are going to be down, so it's going to make your consistency look worse. But if you sprinkle in 2, 3, 4 more touchdowns on the year, which you would expect next year, then it's consistency. Obviously, that means 3 or 4 more games where you were happy to have him in your lineup. But basically, to wrap this whole shits up is I'm telling you that Julio did not fall off. None of the predictive statistics in terms of game speed or target separation or his Matt Harmon's reception perception or yards per route run, none of those predictive statistics fell off, telling me that Julio is exactly the guy we think he is. He just had an outlier of a year in 2017, as did the entire Falcons offense. Matt Ryan threw for 20 touchdowns a year after he threw for 38 touchdowns, guys. So that's really what I'm trying to tell you. He still has no trouble making plays downfield. His his game speed is still far above the NFL league average. He didn't slow down. And in case you're worried about Calvin Ridley in the mix, I wouldn't be. He's a rookie. He won't command more than 80-ish targets. Taylor Gabriel's out of the lineup as well, so he kind of fits in where that is. So listen, dude, I can't really say anything more about Julio other than it was an outlier every year. And I hate drafting guys who are TD dependent, and Julio is pretty much the opposite of that. He will always give you yards and he will always give you catches. If you catch him on the year where he explodes for touchdowns, you're probably looking at a league winner. Yeah, that's really it, man. It's just a lot of recency bias. He finished as wide receiver 4 last year in fantasy despite catching 3 touchdowns. Imagine he caught 6 or 8 touchdowns, guys. You wouldn't even be having this discussion. You'd be looking at him as a locked-in top 8, top 6 pick this year in fantasy. So bounce back for the Falcons. Only good things for Julio I see in the future. All right, so before we move on to MT, Michael Tom, who I also love, I want to let you guys know that throughout the season I do a column. It's just a blog post. I might do a video of it, but I'm not sure. Where I dissect wide receiver versus cornerback matchups. So I look at the Pro Football Focus cornerback matchup sheet that they have on their site, which is a paid thing that I actually subscribe to. So I use that to break down the best wide receiver cornerback matchups based on the slot position and left wide receiver, right wide receiver, and who the best cornerbacks are and stuff like that. So if you're interested in getting emailed that when it comes out on the website, make sure you head over to my website. It's bigdogsfantasy.com, so BIGDOGS fantasy.com. If you scroll down, you'll see a section that just says newsletter. All you got to do is put your name and your email in, and you will be subscribed for the newsletter. So you will be emailed throughout the season. I usually do it on Thursday mornings to get you ready for the weekend. It's good for DFS if you play DFS. I don't personally do that, so I don't put those videos out for a lot of you guys that ask those questions. I don't really do DFS, no, but that will help you for, it's basically sit-start for wide receivers, the wide receiver cornerback matchup for the week, as well as it will help you for DFS. So sign up for the newsletter. And I want to thank today's sponsors for the video. FantasyJocks.com, the industry leader for your fantasy sports league equipment. We're talking belts. We're talking ring-a-lings. I don't even know where my ring went, to be honest with you. I got so goddamn many of them, baby. I'm winning chips left, winning chips right. We don't have a trophy, though. We need a trophy. So they have belts. They got trophies. They got rings. They got live draft boards. If you draft with your friends, if you do a live draft, they got it hooked up. It can go up to, I think, 16 teams, 26 rounds or something like that. So they got it hooked up. Any league can fit on their board. They got all the player stickers that come in the package. They actually have draft packages depending on what your league needs, and they have different ones that come with like a championship belt in them, and ones that come with like a, actually it's pretty funny. They sent me a package somewhere in the background over there with all those boxes. Like a penalty flag, like a yellow penalty flag that you could throw at one of your boys if he's taking too goddamn long to pick. But definitely go check out Fantasy Jocks. I'm trying to get the CEO of Fantasy Jocks to come onto the channel to do one of the behind the scenes of the fantasy football industry, which the new series is starting on my channel. If you're watching this on Monday, tomorrow, the video with Andy from the Fantasy Footballers drops. It was an awesome conversation. I can't wait for you guys to see it and get your reactions and your comments from that. But yeah, I have Andy coming on tomorrow. I have a bunch of guests coming on in the coming weeks, and then trying to get Dustin, the CEO of Fantasy Jocks, to come on to give me a perspective of the industry from someone who's actually selling products in the industry. So I think that's another cool point of view. But definitely go check out FantasyJocks.com. Get 10% off your purchase with Take 10 or Taco Corp as the promo code. All you got to do is get your league mates to chip in $5, $7, $9, $11, and y'all got yourself a belt for life, a trophy forever. Get your championship team names engraved on the side here. I'm telling you, the equipment don't get better than this bad boy. They're number one. They're the go-to. They're the GOAT. Baby, let's move on to Michael Thomas. Now, Thomas is similar to Julio. A lot of the things I said for Thomas go for Julio as well. A monster athlete, super productive, in an offense whose passing statistics were in a down year, and I expect them to bounce back. So, where does that leave us? Michael Thomas or Julio? Michael Thomas coming off a year where he scored just 5 touchdowns, better than Julio's 3, and he had 9 touchdowns in the year prior. So we went from 9, went down to 5. The story of the 2017 Saints can be painted, I think, pretty easily, and it was all around the fact that they moved from a pass-heavy offense to a completely run-first offense behind Mark Ingram and Alvin Kamara, especially in the red zone. Now, I put this chart together to break down what they were doing in the red zone, what their offense was doing down there, and in terms of their scoring preferences and things like that. So, red zone plays overall. They had much less red zone plays in 2017, which is, I guess, kind of surprising, but maybe not, because they ran. My guess on this is because they ran the ball a lot more. They probably ate up a lot more clock. Thus, they probably just ran a lot more plays overall. You see that the red zone plays were a little dipped. The percentage of those passes that were red zone plays were a little bit lower, but nothing that's like statistically significant. However, where you see the dip off is the red zone touchdowns. They scored 10 less red zone touchdowns in that part of the field. And the percentage of passing touchdowns that were red zone touchdowns dipped 14%. So it went from 64% of their red zone touchdowns in 2016 being passing down to 50%, which obviously means that the rushing touchdowns went up from 36 to 50% behind Ingram and Kamara and all these guys scoring rushing touchdowns. However, you got to look at this a bit closer, because people use, just like red zone the red zone stats and like yards per carry and catch rate and completion percentage, tons of different things go into that. So the more minute you can get in these details, the more predictive they can be, which is why we look at 10 zone targets inside the 10-yard line, because those are where the real valuable points are in fantasy football. So we put together the exact same chart, but inside the 10 zone. You see the same thing in terms of volume. A big decrease in terms of plays in the 10 zone. 114 down to 69 last year. Very nice. Percentage of passes, though, does dip off. When they got closer, they were running the ball in the 10 zone as compared to passing. We basically flipped. Where it was like a 55 to 45 in terms of passes in 2016, flipped. 45% passes, 55% rushes. The touchdowns, again, dropped 39 down to 27. So there wasn't even a lot of scoring opportunity down there in the 10. The percentage of passing touchdowns that came inside the 10-yard line in 2016 was 62%. That dropped all the way down to 44% in 2017. So an 18% drop-off, guys. It's pretty crazy. Now, the reason I do expect this to go back a little bit more in favor of passing is because Mark Ingram is suspended for the first 4 games, and we don't know what his role is going to even be when he comes back. Ingram had 19 10-zone rushes last year, and tied for the 5th most rushes inside the 5-yard line. So he was like top 5 in terms of goal line rushes. So he's out of there. It's unlikely that they're just going to force the ball to Kamara or whoever their other back, whether it's Terrence West or whoever is that like pounder role. So I think they will probably rely more on Drew Brees, which could be a much better thing for Michael Thomas. And just looking at the team overall, look at this chart. It might be a little small on your screen, so I apologize if it is, but it's basically the pass rate, so the percentage of plays that were passes inside the 10-yard line. You see Miami must know some shit that no one else knows, because they're up at 80% passing the ball inside the 10-yard line. New Orleans, you have to find them all the way on the bottom of the chart. Only 5 teams passed the ball less than they did inside the 10-yard line last year. That was Washington, Carolina, Dallas, Jacksonville, Tennessee. All makes sense because Tennessee obviously is exotic smashed mouth football. Jacksonville has Fournette. Dallas has that O-line with Zeke. Carolina has Cam Newton. And you know they love to feed Jonathan Stewart, so they basically have 2 goal line backs there. Washington was a bit of a surprise for me, to be honest with you, but I think it's because their attempts were pretty low, 26 attempts. And then New Orleans, 45% there. So they were not passing the ball when they got inside the 10-yard line. So we move on from there. Having him gone is probably going to give Brees and Thomas more value inside the 10-yard line, which is where all the value comes from. And Drew Brees, just like Matt Ryan, also saw really low numbers in statistical categories from a usage standpoint. I'm just going to read off some stats for you. His 536 pass attempts last year were a full 137 less attempts than he had just a year prior. 137 less passes. And that was his lowest total ever in 12 years in New Orleans. So his lowest total in a Saints uniform last year in terms of pass attempts, as was his 4.29 touchdown rate percentage. Both numbers we expect to go up, at least, if not back up to where they were, maybe to the average, or just, no way they go down. They're definitely going up in that sense, because that's how you dissect these quarterbacks and see which kind of progression or regression we can expect from them. And considering these were his lowest numbers in terms of touchdown rate and pass attempts in 12 years, we could definitely expect them to go back up. The craziest thing about Brees is he had that low number of touchdowns, right? That was the first time he missed 32 touchdowns since 2007. He has had 32 passing touchdowns in every single season since 2007. How many did he end up having last year? Actually, I don't even have that in here. What a fraud I am. Where art thou? Load for a young ninja. 23 touchdowns last year. The first time since 2007 he did not hit 32 passing touchdowns, y'all. Let that ring in your mind. And again, this goes back to what I said with Julio. When you look at these down years, you have to decide between whether they were outlier years or whether the guy is actually falling off. Because Brees, at his old age, you could easily say, he's getting older. Maybe he's not that good anymore. That was not the case. Again, just like for Julio, he set the record for the highest completion percentage of his career last year, completing 72% of his passes. His 8 interceptions were his lowest total since 2004, and he led the NFL in yards per attempt. He was completely efficient last year, and on top of his game, it was just a low volume total, which basically what I said, we expect that to go up, which is always is going to be parallel to Michael Thomas's usage going up. With Ingram out, that's just more incentive for them to pass the ball. But let's look at Thomas, man. We can't just talk about Drew Brees without talking about Thomas, because this video is all about Michael Thomas. He just turned 24 years old. Yes, he is unbelievably young, and I would take Michael Thomas over Julio in a dynasty league any day of the week. But this is for redraft purposes, guys. Yes, Michael Thomas over Julio in dynasty. Michael Thomas in redraft, you'll have to wait for my conclusion. He's entering his 3rd year, and we see that 3rd years are usually like the breakouts for the wide receiver, but he doesn't need that. He hit the breakout year immediately. Year 1, 92 catches, 1,137 yards, 9 touchdowns. Last year in year 2, 104 catches, 1,245 yards, 5 tugs for the man's Michael Thomas. We're looking at nearly 200 catches, 2,400 receiving yards, and 14 touchdowns over his first 2 seasons. He's finished as wide receiver 7 in fantasy, 2016, and then wide receiver 5 last year, despite scoring just 5 times. I don't need to sit here and argue just how good Thomas is as a player. The question becomes, what is his outlook for 2018? Can he take a huge step up? Can he hit that top 3? Can he become a real elite player? Can he challenge that number 1 spot for the fantasy throne? Can Michael Thomas do it? Let's look at it. This chart right here, I wanted to see how he was being used in this offense. How much does Brees really love Michael Thomas? And I put together this kind of disgusting chart, so just stay with me. That middle column is Drew Brees. The one all the way to the right is Michael Thomas. We're looking at air yards. We're looking at ADOT, which is average depth of target, and we're looking at 10 zone. So we have both 10 zone attempts and 10 zone targets and touchdowns. So in the first column, you see air yards. Michael Thomas, his air yards, or Drew Brees' air yards decreased by almost 1,400. Michael Thomas's went up by almost 400. He only had 21% of Brees' air yards in 2016. He had almost 39% of Drew Brees' air yards in 2017. Air yards are a very good thing, guys. You want air yards when you're a wide receiver. Average depth of target. Now, his Brees' average depth of target dropped from 7.7 to 6.9, which is a big reason why we saw his completion percentage so damn high, because obviously throwing shorter passes, it's easier to complete those passes. Michael Thomas, however, his average depth of target went up 8.2 to 10.2. So you could see Brees throwing the ball less, throwing the ball not as far, right? But Michael Thomas is still getting more air yards, more percentage of air yards, a higher average depth of target. Then you look inside the 10 zone, right? So Brees' numbers, we kind of already looked at this. His attempts went down from 62 to 31. His touchdowns in that area went down from 24 to 12. Michael Thomas was pretty much similarly involved despite the same amount of volume for Brees. So he went from 11 down to 9, 6 touchdowns down to 5. Basically, we're seeing Brees' long balls, his valuable passes, and inside the 10. All that stuff dropped off from a volume standpoint, but Michael Thomas's did not. he actually took a larger percentage, and his numbers overall went up in terms of air yards and average depth of target, which was surprising, seeing the number of volume fall off for Breeze, but not for Thomas. Thomas held a 28% target share on the Saints last year, which was tied for the third highest in the entire NFL. D-Hop had 35% of his team's targets, Antonio Brown had 30%, and then Michael Thomas was number 3, tied for number 3 at 28%. In my eyes, that's a great thing, because what that says is Drew Brees trusts Michael Thomas as the game changer, the elite wide receiver one. Like, a wide receiver doesn't hit those type of target percentages. There are very few guys. There are the AJ Greens, the Odell Beckhams, the Julio Joneses, the DeAndre Hopkinses, the Antonio Browns. Those are the only guys that really ever hit 28% of their team's targets or higher. And Michael Thomas did that in his second year, which tells you that Drew Brees absolutely loves him. And then I just want to put this tweet in real quick that Michael Thomas himself actually retweeted. Highest reception percentage of receivers with a minimum of 200 targets the last 2 seasons. So just his catch rate. Michael Thomas has incredible hands, which is good considering he's getting further and further passes, like longer passes from Breeze, but he's catching more and more of them. His catch rate is really, 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 really high. So that's a huge piece of having huge trust factor in Breeze, right? That's the reason Breeze is throwing him the ball more, because he trusts Michael Thomas to catch the ball, and obviously he's been the best at catching the ball in the entire NFL over the last 2 years. So this is all good stuff for Michael Thomas, all good stuff for Julio Jones. Here is where the difference comes in for me. Their receiving core, the Saints receiving core, is a little tricky in order to project volume there. They still have Teddy Ginn, and by all statistic predictive measures, target separation, game speed, Teddy Ginn was just as good as he's ever been last year. So Teddy Ginn is not going anywhere. They bring in free agent wideout Cameron Meredith, who was an absolute stud before suffering all those injuries last year. Chicago let him go. The Saints picked him up, and he's running out of the slot, apparently. He's a bigger receiver, but they have him in the slot. Either way, he's going to be on the field for a pretty good amount of time. I've seen videos of him at training camp. He looks really good, I'll be honest with you. He looks very, 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 very good, and I think he's going to be a factor in this offense. They also drafted Traquan Smith, who is a favorite of a lot of Twitter football dudes. He's more of like a long threat and probably the predecessor to Ted Ginn, but nonetheless, it's adding more weapons to the mix. He played for UCF, by the way. Traquan, the only real national champions we acknowledge here at the HQ. They also bring in Ben Watson. So as much as I think those red zone attempts are going to go up, Ben Watson is a guy who had that career year with Breeze and with the Saints back in 2015, I think it was. 74, 825, 6. 74 catches, 825 yards, 6 touchdowns that year. And again, looking at his separation, his game speed, Ben Watson, although he's freaking old, he dominated for the Ravens last year, over the last year, and his numbers have not gone down in terms of speed, playing speed on the field and stuff like that. He led the team in red zone targets and 10 zone targets by a wide margin that year that he blew up for the Saints. So that tells me that Breeze was comfortable throwing him the ball at that part of the field, which means he'll probably be able to do that again in 2018. So when it comes down to it, a huge piece of Thomas's outlook is whether or not you think the volume in the Saints passing game goes back up. I think it certainly does. Maybe not the 2016 levels where it was crazy for Breeze, because he attempted, it's funny because Breeze attempted a career high in passing attempts in 2016, 673, and then in 2017 he basically saw the low. So they'll probably meet somewhere in the middle. The only problem is that Thomas has a much more crowded receiving core. So to get to the conclusion here, when it comes down to it, guys, when it comes down to it, anyone who had Julio last year is probably going to be like, fade. Fade, 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 fade. And I would say, yes, fade Julio. By that, I mean watch him catch fucking fades down the field from Matt Ryan this year and be disgusted that you skipped out on him. You're looking at this from a recency bias standpoint. You're not looking at it from a statistical standpoint, guys. Julio is just as good as he's ever been. Last year was a big outlier year for him. And that's really what, I implore you not to just write off Julio for the fact that you probably owned him last year. So we have 2 guys whose passing game I expect to improve, either by volume or efficiency or by both. We have clear wide receiver ones in their offense with clear elite talent at the wide receiver positions. 2 guys coming off low touchdown seasons. 2 guys who don't depend on touchdowns. They rack up both catches and yards consistently. Clearly, I love both of these guys. The problem I have with Michael Thomas is, again, the receiving core is crowded. But what's more so is I think if I had to bank on one of these offenses to bounce back more in terms of a passing volume offense, it's going to be the Falcons. And the reason I say that is because Breeze is locked up, right? Breeze is locked up for, I think, 2 more years through 2019. So this year, next year, they realize that they have a very, very small Super Bowl window, and it is these next 2 years. And they realize that the only way they're going to get to the Super Bowl is by keeping Drew Brees healthy. So what have they done? They stacked up their running backs. They've used them wildly in their running game. Last year, they threw the ball to their running backs. I think we have a percentage. 32% of their plays, 32% of their passes were passes to their running backs, which was an NFL high by 4%. The next closest team was San Francisco at 28%. Cue the Jerick McKinnon drum rolls for Kyle Shanahan plus McKinnon. Going to catch 500 balls this year. And New England, who always throws their running backs a ton. Those are the two closest teams, but the Saints pace them by 4 and 5%. So that is what the Saints' game plan is. It is to run the ball, and it is when they're passing, which is a very low volume of time, it is to pass to the running backs who are great pass catchers. They're keeping Breeze out of the pocket for as long as possible, as well as on his feet for as long as possible, not taking hits. That is why I think they kind of are probably going to continue with the same game plan that they had last year. It was one of my arguments for Breeze. Last year I put Drew Brees in my top busts video and I got a shitload of hate for it, and it wasn't because I didn't like Breeze. It was because, that was my argument. I was like, they see the Super Bowl run, this is their window, they're going to have to keep Breeze on his feet. And they're going to do that by running the ball. And that's why they signed 3 running backs last year, because that was their game plan going into the year. And it will be their game plan again going into this year. So what I'm saying is, I don't think Thomas has anywhere near the ceiling that Jones does this year, strictly because I don't think the volume in the passing game is going to be there, and I think there's a much more crowded receiving core there. Julio doesn't really have to compete for targets. It's Calvin Ridley, yes, but Taylor Gabriel is gone, and Mohamed Sanu is never a guy who he had to compete for targets with. I think Ridley will probably eat more into Sanu. You have Austin Hooper has literally proved nothing to anyone since he's been in the league, so I'm not worried about that. I'm just not sure the volume will be there for Michael Thomas, but I do think it will be, again, there for Julio Jones. Would be surprised if he didn't hit 80 catches and 1,400 yards again this year, which is what you look for in a fantasy wide receiver. You don't chase touchdowns because they will come as a natural result of producing the other statistics. So, that being said, I go back to Julio, and I hope this video helped you guys out for picking in the early second round or the late first round, and that's the best I could do for you. So, if you enjoyed the video, please give that video a thumbs up, give it a 5-star rating and review if you are on the podcast. Subscribe to the channel if you're new. We're doing this every Monday. We're pretty much on full time now. I think I got 7 videos a week dropping for y'all, so I'm on my grind, my content season. Let me know down below who you guys want, either Julio or Michael Thomas, baby. That's that.